They called it the ugliest thing in 3 counties. A rusted cylinder of forgotten grain, standing like a wounded soldier at the edge of Miller's field, its metal skin peeling away in orange flakes that stained the dry grass beneath it. The paint had surrendered decades ago, leaving behind a skeleton of corrugated steel pocked with holes the size of quarters. And the door, if you could call it that, hung crooked on a single hinge that screamed every time the wind pushed against it. Farmers had driven past it for 20 years without a second glance. Children dared each other to throw rocks at it. Real estate agents listed the property 3 times and removed it 3 times. Unable to find a single buyer willing to haul away the embarrassment. And on a Thursday morning in late October, when the auctioneer raised his gavel and called out the lot number, the crowd laughed. They laughed out loud. They laughed because the starting bid was $50, and even at that price, nobody wanted the liability. Nobody except Elara Voss. Elara was 28 years old, though the lines around her eyes made her look closer to 40 on bad days, and the autumn of her life had been nothing but a series of bad days strung together like rotten pearls on a broken necklace. 6 months earlier, she had been a junior architect in the city, designing clean lines and glass facades for clients who paid her to make the world look perfect. Then the firm downsized. Then her savings evaporated. Then her marriage ended. Not with shouting or betrayal, but with the quiet suffocation of 2 people realizing they had mistaken proximity for love. Marcus had kept the apartment. Marcus had kept the car. Marcus had kept their friends, because Marcus was the one who smiled at dinner parties, while Elara sat in corners sketching floor plans on napkins. All she had taken was a duffel bag of clothes, a box of architecture books she no longer opened, and a bank account that hovered dangerously close to 3 digits. She had driven until her gas tank begged for mercy, landing in the town of Hartwell, population 4,000 and shrinking, where her mother owned a cramped cottage on the wrong side of the railroad tracks and made it very clear that charity had an expiration date. The auction had not been Elara's idea. Her mother had read about it in the local paper, a liquidation sale for the old Hendricks farm, and had insisted that Elara attend, because sitting in the kitchen staring at unpaid bills was not a personality trait, according to her. So Elara had gone, wearing her last clean sweater and a pair of boots with soles worn thin as paper, standing at the back of a crowd that smelled like tobacco and tractor grease and decades of resentment toward change. She had no intention of buying anything. She had no money to buy anything. But when the auctioneer gestured toward the silo, with the kind of theatrical disgust usually reserved for spoiled meat, something inside her chest shifted, not her heart. Something deeper. Something that remembered what it felt like to look at a crumbling blueprint and see a finished building before a single brick had been laid. The auctioneer called out $50. And the silence was so complete that a crow's caw from the distant tree line sounded like an alarm. Then someone snickered. Then someone else. Then the whole crowd was laughing. The kind of laughter that carries no joy, only the relief of shared superiority. Old man Hendricks himself, sitting in a folding chair near the barn, shook his head and muttered something about city girls and their delusions. Elara's mother, who had come along to keep her grounded, grabbed her daughter's elbow and hissed that this was not the time for pride. But Elara wasn't feeling pride. She was feeling something else entirely. She was feeling the strange, irrational certainty that sometimes visits people who have already lost everything, the certainty that there is nothing left to fear, and therefore nothing stopping you from reaching for something absurd. She raised her hand, the laughter sputtered, then returned louder, like an engine catching. The auctioneer, a man named Gary, who had sold cattle and combines and condemned houses for 30 years, looked at her with the kind of pity usually reserved for stray dogs. "Do I hear 75? He called out. Hoping someone would rescue the girl from herself, nobody moved. The crowd wanted to watch the train wreck. They wanted to see the pretty failure from the city spend her last dollars on a rusted coffin in a field. Gary dropped the gavel. $100. Sold! To the young lady with the dead eyes and the stubborn jaw. And as Elara walked toward the silo to claim her prize, the laughter followed her like a shadow. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the bakery and knew everyone's business before they knew it themselves, cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted that she hoped. Elara enjoyed her new castle. 3 teenagers near the fence line took photos with their phones, already composing the captions. Even the auctioneer shook her hand with a grip that felt like an apology. Elara stood in front of the silo that afternoon, her mother having stormed off to the car in a performance of maternal disappointment. And she ran her palm along the rusted metal. It was warm. The October sun had baked the steel all morning, and inside she could feel the trapped heat radiating outward like a slow breath. She pulled the crooked door open, the hinge screaming its familiar scream, and stepped into the darkness. The smell hit her first. Not the rot she expected, but something earthy and ancient, like a cave or a cellar or the underside of a forest floor. Her eyes adjusted slowly. The interior was a cylinder of shadow, 30 feet high and 18 feet across, the walls curving upward into a cone that had lost most of its roofing panels. Rain had entered, yes, but not as much as she feared. The floor was a mixture of old grain dust, compacted earth, and something else. Something that crunched softly beneath her boots and released a faint, sweet aroma when she disturbed it. She knelt in the dim light and touched the ground, and her fingers came away dusted with white. Mycelium, the threads of something growing, something alive. She didn't know it then. She couldn't have known. But the silo had been sitting empty for 2 decades. And in those 2 decades, nature had been conducting an experiment. The rusted walls, pocked with holes, created a ventilation system that no engineer could have designed better if they tried. Air moved in and out in slow, rhythmic cycles, maintaining a humidity that stayed constant between 60 and 70%, regardless of the season. The concrete foundation, poured in 1962 with limestone aggregate from the local quarry, had slowly released calcium into the soil base, raising the pH to a perfect neutral that most fungi found irresistible. And the grain dust, that ancient residue of corn and wheat, had become a substrate so rich in nutrients that it was essentially pre-composted gold. The silo wasn't a ruin. It was a laboratory. It was an incubator. It was, in the language that Elara would later use when investors asked her about her versatility infrastructure, a naturally occurring climate-controlled fruiting chamber that had taken 20 years to build itself. But that afternoon, she only knew that the air felt right. It felt like potential. She went back to her mother's cottage, endured a 3-hour lecture about responsibility and embarrassment, and what the neighbors were saying. And then she lay awake until 3 in the morning staring at the ceiling. At 3:15 she opened her laptop and began to research. Not architecture, not job listings. Mushrooms. She read about oyster mushrooms, and shiitake, and lion's mane, and reishi, She read about substrates and inoculation and fruiting conditions and humidity control. She watched videos of people growing fungi in basements and garages and abandoned buildings. And with every video, her heart beat faster because she recognized something. She recognized the same feeling she used to get when she looked at an empty lot and saw a building. She was seeing the invisible again. The next morning, she went back to the silo with a flashlight and a notebook. She measured the interior temperature, 68 degrees, stable. She measured the humidity with a cheap device she bought at the hardware store, 62%. She collected samples of the white threads in plastic bags and drove 2 hours to the Agricultural Extension Office in the next county, where a mycologist named Dr. Helen Yao looked at her samples under a microscope and then looked at Elara with an expression that bordered on awe. "This is Pleurotus austriatus," Dr. Yao said, pointing to the branching white filaments. "Oyster mushroom mycelium. And it's healthy, remarkably healthy." "Where did you find this?" Elara told her about the silo. Dr. Yao asked about the structure, the ventilation, the foundation. When Elara described the rust holes and the limestone concrete and the grain dust, Dr. Yao sat back in her chair and laughed. But this time, it was not the laughter of mockery. It was the laughter of someone who had just witnessed a coincidence so perfect it felt like destiny. "You didn't buy a silo," Dr. Yao said. "You bought a mushroom farm that doesn't know it's a mushroom farm yet." Elara spent her last $87 on spawn. Not the fancy stuff from commercial suppliers, but from a small organic farm 3 counties over that sold bags of inoculated straw for $12 each. She bought 7 bags. She carried them back to Hartwell in the passenger seat of her mother's old sedan, the bags sweating slightly in the afternoon heat. And she placed them in the silo like offerings at an altar. The work began the next day. She cleaned the interior with a broom made from branches because she couldn't afford a real one. She patched the largest holes in the roof with scavenged tin she found in the barn. Not to seal the silo completely. She needed the ventilation, but to control the water flow so rain wouldn't pool in any single spot. She built shelves from discarded pallets she found behind the grocery store, sanding them with borrowed sandpaper until they wouldn't splinter the bags. She woke at 5 every morning, before the town stirred, and worked until the light failed, her hands blistering, her back aching, her clothes always damp from the silo's perfect humidity. The townspeople watched. Of course they watched. Hartwell had nothing else to watch. Mrs. Patterson began a running commentary from her bakery window, updating customers on the girl and her rust bucket with the kind of narrative enthusiasm usually reserved for natural disasters. The teenagers who had taken photos at the auction returned weekly, documenting what they assumed would be a slow-motion collapse. Old man Hendricks, who had sold the property, drove past once a week in his pickup, slowing to a crawl to stare at the silo with the confused resentment of a man who had discarded something and now suspected, without understanding why, that he had made a mistake. Even Marcus called, once from the city, his voice carrying that particular tone of concerned condescension that had defined their marriage. "Elara," he said, "I heard you're living in a grain bin. You know you can come back. You don't have to prove anything to anyone." She hung up without answering. She wasn't proving anything. She was building something. And the difference between those two things was the difference between a prison and a cathedral. Week 2 brought contamination. Green mold, trichoderma, the bane of every mushroom grower, bloomed across 2 of her bags like a toxic flower. And Elara sat in the silo at midnight with a headlamp, cutting out the infected sections with a kitchen knife, her heart hammering against her ribs. Tears streaming down her face, not from sadness, but from the sheer crushing weight of having everything you own, which was almost nothing, threatened by something you can't see. She removed the contaminated bags. She sterilized the shelves. With bleach she diluted until it was almost water because she couldn't afford to waste it. She increased the airflow by cutting 2 additional vents near the base, using a hacksaw she found in the barn, her arms trembling with exhaustion. And she started again. Week 4 brought the first pinning. Tiny white nubs, no larger than pencil erasers, pushing through the straw like the first words of a language she was only beginning to learn. She photographed them obsessively, her phone's memory filling with images of clustered growth that nobody else would find beautiful, but that made her weep with relief. She adjusted the humidity by spraying the walls with water from a recycled spray bottle, timing the evaporation rates, charting the temperature fluctuations on graph paper she stole from her mother's crossword puzzle book. She learned the silo's moods. She learned which holes let in too much dry air in the afternoon, and which ones brought cool moisture at dawn. She learned that the eastern wall, where the morning sun hit the metal, created a thermal current that rose to the roof and circulated downward along the western curve, creating an invisible spiral that kept the air moving just enough to prevent stagnation, but not so much that it dried the mycelium. She was not just growing mushrooms. She was learning to read a building's breath. By month 2, she had her first harvest. Not much. Maybe 3 pounds of oyster mushrooms, their caps the colour of pale suede, their gills running down the stems like waterfalls frozen in cream. She carried them to the Hartwell Farmers Market in a wicker basket lined with damp cloth, and she set up a folding table next to the tomato vendors and the honey sellers. Mrs. Patterson walked past 3 times without acknowledging her. The teenagers who had documented her failure took photos of her table, their smirks undimmed. She sold the 3 pounds in 40 minutes. A chef from a restaurant in the next town bought 2 pounds at $8 per pound and asked if she could supply more. A woman with arthritis bought half a pound because she had read that oyster mushrooms reduced inflammation. A young mother bought some because her children thought they looked like flowers. Elara took the $24 home and taped it to the wall of the silo. It was the first money she had earned in 8 months. It was the first thing she had built in longer than that. Month 3 brought expansion. She bought more spawn, not 7 bags but 20, using the market profits and a small loan from Dr. Yao, who had become an unlikely mentor, driving out to Hartwell every other weekend to examine the silo's conditions and shake her head in disbelief. The rust, Dr. Yao kept saying. The rust is the key. Those holes create microclimates, different zones with different humidity levels. You could grow 3 species in here simultaneously if you managed it right. So Elara tried. She sectioned the silo with plastic sheeting, creating chambers. The upper shelves, where the air was drier and warmer, received shiitake logs, oak branches she inoculated herself, drilling holes with a borrowed drill, sealing them with wax from a local beekeeper. The middle section stayed with oyster mushrooms, the reliable workhorses, and the lower shelves, where the air was coolest and most humid, received lion's mane, the cascading white fungus that looked like frozen waterfalls and sold for $20 a pound to specialty buyers. She worked alone. Always alone. Her mother had softened slightly, bringing her sandwiches at noon, and leaving them on the hood of the car without entering the silo. As if the structure itself were a contagion, Marcus sent 2 more texts, which she deleted unread. The townspeople's laughter had not stopped, but it had changed pitch, becoming less certain, more defensive. The laughter of people who sense that the joke might be turning against them, but aren't ready to admit it yet. Elara didn't notice. She was too busy mixing substrates from coffee grounds she collected free from the diner, and sawdust from the local mill, and soybean hulls from the co-op. Too busy monitoring pH levels with strips she cut in half to make them last longer. Too busy harvesting at 4:30 a.m. when the mushrooms were freshest and the air was still, her hands moving through the clusters with the tenderness of a mother checking her child's fever. Month 4 brought the first major order. The chef who had bought from her at the market had been experimenting, and his oyster mushroom risotto had become the restaurant's signature dish. He needed £20 a week. £20. She stood in the silo after hanging up the phone. The flip phone she had bought refurbished for $19. And she looked at those shifts. The mycelium had spread. It had colonized not just the bags, but the wooden shelves, the concrete floor, the very air itself, filling the silo with a white, webbed presence that felt less like a farm and more like a living organism. She could supply £20. She would need to work harder, sleep less, build more shelves, find more substrate materials. But she could do it. She had been an architect once, trained to calculate loads and stresses and capacities. This was no different. The silo had a capacity. She just had to find it. So she built. She built shelves from scavenged lumber and cinder blocks. She built a misting system from PVC pipes she found at the dump, and a small pump she repaired from a discarded fountain. She built relationships with every business in Hartwell that produced organic waste. The bakery's old bread, the brewery's spent grain, the coffee shop's grounds, turning their trash into her substrate gold. She built a routine that began at 4 a.m. and ended at 10 p.m., her body lean and strong from carrying bags and mixing materials, and climbing the rickety ladder she had lashed to the silo's interior wall. The rusted metal, which had once seemed like decay, now seemed like character. The holes, which had seemed like damage, now seemed like design. The silo, which had been the town's shame, was becoming its most interesting secret. Month 5 brought press. A food blogger from the city, driving through Hartwell on a rural tourism assignment, had heard rumours about the mushroom silo from the chef who bought Elara's produce. She arrived with a camera and a recorder, and Elara, who had not spoken to a journalist in her life, showed her the interior with the pride of a museum curator. The blogger wrote an article titled "The $100 Castle: How One Woman Turned a Rusted Silo into a Fungal Paradise." It received 12,000 shares. The next week, Elara's phone, her $19 flip phone, rang 20 times a day. Restaurants in 3 states wanted samples. A distributor called about a wholesale contract. A venture capitalist, the kind of person who normally wouldn't drive through Hartwell unless he was lost, sent an email offering $200,000 for a 50% stake in what he called her operation. She declined, not out of pride, but because she didn't know what 50% meant yet, and because the silo was still teaching her, and she wasn't ready to share the teacher. Month 6 brought scale. She hired her first employee, a 17-year-old named Jake, whose father had worked the Hendricks farm before it failed, and who knew the land and the weather and the rhythms of rural life that Elara was still learning. She didn't hire him in an office. She hired him in the silo at 5 a.m. showing him how to identify ready clusters by the curve of the cap and the slight separation of the gills from the stem. She taught him to harvest with a twist rather than a cut, because the twist left the mycelium intact and ready for the next flush. She taught him to listen to the silo's breathing, to feel the humidity on his skin, to read the rusted walls like a barometer. He learned fast. They built a second structure next to the silo, not a silo, but a converted shipping container she bought for $800, insulated and modified to mimic the original's perfect conditions. Then a third. The empire was growing outward from its rusted heart. Each new chamber a copy of the first, each one learning from the silo's ancient wisdom. Month 7 brought the numbers. The real numbers. The kind of numbers that make people stop laughing and start listening. In 7 months, Elara Voss had gone from 7 bags of spawn to a facility. She still called it the farm, though it no longer resembled anything agricultural in the traditional sense. That produced 400 pounds of mushrooms per week. At an average wholesale price of $12 per pound, she was grossing nearly $5,000 weekly. Her client list included 14 restaurants, 3 grocery chains, 2 pharmaceutical companies researching mushroom-derived compounds, and a cosmetics brand that used her lion's mane extract in a premium serum. The operation employed 6 people from Hartwell, kids who had been planning to leave for the city, old farmers who had thought their working days were over. The tax revenue alone had convinced the town council to pave the road leading to the silo, a road that had been gravel and mud for 40 years, and the valuation. That was the number that travelled fastest. A business magazine, doing a feature on rural innovation, had a financial analyst estimate the worth of Elara's operation, the contracts, the proprietary growing methods, the brand recognition, the expansion potential, at just over $1 million. $1 million. From a $100 purchase. From a rusted cylinder that people had driven past for 2 decades, pointing at it as evidence of decline, using it as a punchline, treating it as a symbol of everything that rural America had become. The article used the word empire. Elara, when she read it, sat in the silo's center, on the spot where she had first knelt and touched the white dust, and she cried, not because she was happy, though she was, but because she finally understood that the building she had bought was not a ruin. It was a seed. And seeds don't look like much until you understand what they're capable of becoming. The article changed everything in Hartwell. Mrs. Patterson, who had spent 7 months narrating Elara's presumed failure, began selling mushroom muffins at her bakery, using Elara's product, and telling customers that she had always known that girl was special. The teenagers who had documented the auction with their phones returned, asking for internships. Their smirks replaced by the desperate enthusiasm of young people, who sense that they are watching history happen in their own backyard. Old man Hendricks drove his pickup to the silo one morning, parked it with the engine running, and sat there for 20 minutes staring at the structure he had abandoned. He didn't come in, he didn't need to. The sign on the gate said enough. Hartwell Fungi. By appointment only. But the moment Elara had been waiting for, the moment she had not admitted to herself that she was waiting for, came on a Tuesday in the 7th month, when a silver sedan she recognized pulled up the newly paved road. Marcus stepped out. He looked different, smaller, somehow, though he was the same height he had always been. He wore a coat she had bought him 2 Christmases ago, and he carried a folder that she knew from years of living with him. contained printed articles and financial projections, and whatever other props he needed to make his point feel inevitable. "Elara," he said, and his voice had that same tone, that concerned condescension, but now it was wrapped in something else. Something that looked like respect, but tasted like fear. "I read about you. This is incredible. I had no idea you were capable of something like this." She stood in the doorway of the silo, the original silo, which she had kept as her office and her laboratory, and her reminder. She was wearing overalls stained with substrate and boots caked with the rich earth of her success. Her hands, once smooth from drafting table work, were scarred and strong, and currently holding a cluster of oyster mushrooms the size of a bouquet. "Capable," she repeated, tasting the word. "You mean you didn't think I was capable?" Marcus shifted, the folder crinkling in his grip. "I didn't mean it like that. I meant I didn't understand what you needed, what you were going through. But I see it now. I see what you've built, and I think we could help each other. I have business contacts. I could help you scale. I could help you move to the city, open a real facility, leave this." He gestured at the silo, at Hartwell, at everything she had built. "This behind." Elara looked at him. She looked at the folder. She looked at the silo behind her, the rusted walls that had taught her more about resilience than any architecture school ever could. She thought about the mornings alone, in the dark, the contaminated bags, the blisters, the $24 taped to the wall that was still there, faded now, but still visible. She thought about Dr. Yao's face when she had first seen the mycelium. She thought about Jake, learning to harvest with a twist. She thought about the road, paved for the first time because of fungus, growing in a place everyone had abandoned. "I don't need help scaling," she said quietly. "I don't need business contacts. And I don't need to leave." Marcus opened his mouth, the concerned expression hardening into something more familiar. "Elara, be reasonable. This is a fluke, a lucky break. You got lucky with a building and some mold. You don't have the training for this level of business. You don't have the education. You're an architect, not a farmer, not a CEO." She smiled then. It was not a cruel smile. It was not the smile of revenge. It was the smile of someone who had finally, completely, and permanently stopped needing anyone else's definition of who she was. "I was an architect," she said. "Now I build things that grow. And the difference is that when I finish with a building, it's done. When I finish with this," she held up the mushrooms, their gills catching the afternoon light filtering through the rust holes. "It keeps going. It keeps building itself. That's not luck, Marcus. That's design. Just not the kind you can draw on paper." She stepped back into the silo, into the humidity and the earth smell and the living breath of her $1,000,000 empire. She did not close the door. She didn't need to. The door hung crooked on its single hinge, just as it always had, and it was enough. It had always been enough. Marcus stood in the gravel for a while longer, the folder growing heavy in his hand, the sound of his own breathing loud in his ears. Then he turned and walked back to the silver sedan, and he drove away down the paved road, past the sign that said Hartwell Fungi, past Mrs. Patterson's bakery where the mushroom muffins were selling out by noon, past the teenagers who were now documenting something entirely different, and past the old Hendricks farm, where a rusted silo stood like a cathedral in the afternoon sun, its holes letting in light, its walls breathing, its interior alive with 1,000,000 threads of white, growing, always growing, proving that the only thing more powerful than laughter is the quiet, stubborn certainty of someone who knows how to look at a ruin and see a revolution.